Hi, I'm Rory Jones and welcome to Lavender Hall Fishery. If you want to learn how to catch big bags of commercial silverfish like this, then this video is for you. One of my favourite ground baits to use is the new sweet fish meal Magic. Magic's been around since the dinosaurs, but the addition of fish meal has just made this mix a little bit better for when you're fishing commercial fisheries or natural venues that perhaps see carp anglers that feed pellets. It's a lovely ground bait, quite sticky. If you're feeding chopworms and casters, dead maggots, perhaps some pellets and corn, it really binds the bait together well. It's a particularly good mix for big roach and skimmers. You can use it both in the feeder and on the pole. Today we're at Lavender Hall Fishery and we're going to be looking to catch skimmers on the long pole over this mix, feeding chopworms and pellets. I'll just show you how we mix the ground bait to get it right for holding that sort of bait together. It's important to get the ground bait right at the start of a session, because if you don't, you'll ruin the peg before you've even started. Very simple. Just upend the bag into a bowl. Make sure you've got a decent supply of water next to you. And really turn the ground bait over, making sure that all of it gets nice and wet. It's got a lovely smell, Magic. It's almost cakey, sweet, far sweeter than lake. Already coming together quite nicely now. It's got a nice dark brown colour, perfect for most commercial fisheries that tend to have a sort of clayey or silty bottom. Because the fish we're trying to catch today are roach and decent sized skimmers, we want a fairly inert ground bait. You don't want much coming off the bottom because it'll draw the fish up off the deck and it'll make catching them quite difficult. You might end up with lots of line bites and very few actual positive indications. So what I've actually done is over wetted the ground bait. It'll form a nice soft ball, the water's not particularly deep, and it'll go down nicely to the bottom and make a good carpet of bait for the fish to come and graze over. Keep turning the bait over, make sure that every particle has got a bit of water in it. That for me is already perfect to use. It'll just need to go through a riddle before the start and it'll be ready to feed into the peg. Try and do it an hour before you start fishing, because that way the water's absorbed properly and you should have very little activity in the mix. We're going to look at starting the session now. It's best to always feed the line that you're going to start on first. We're going to start at 5 metres today, so I'm just going to put a little dollop of chopped worm and a few casters in on this 5 metre line. Although we're going to be feeding it out of our hand, it's still nice to just know that you've got a little bit of bait down there that you're going to be fishing over the top of. And just while I've got the pot there, just throw a few casters so you've got an idea of your range. We'll now look at feeding the long line. I'm going to pop 3 balls of this sweet fish meal Magic that we've already prepared. Plenty of grub in this. Not going to be fishing this long line, I would think, for probably 2 hours. So it's important to know that there's a reasonable spread of bait on the bottom for these skimmers when they decide to come into the peg. A nice far bank marker there. We'll just roll the pole over, drop these balls in. No need to rush. You don't want to spill the ball and drop it somewhere else in the swim. Now, it's a nice still day today, so what I'm hoping is that we'll actually be able to tell when the skimmers come into the peg. I'm going to pop this ground bait in, and when they turn up, I'd hope that they'll actually start fizzing. And when they start fizzing, they've given the game away. And you know the fish are in the peg, and it's just a matter of time before they start feeding properly, and you'll be able to drop a rig in and hopefully catch them. When we're fishing this 5 metre line, you'll be able to just keep an eye and look out for that fizzing. That's the long line fed. The bait that we've put in there has been relatively soft. The water's only 3 foot deep, so there's no need to put it in particularly hard. Just nice soft balls that are going to go down to the bottom and break down quite quickly, and a nice big carpet of bait down there for these skimmers to come in on. Now I'm going to look at starting for these roach now on this short pole line. There's a good chance of catching some skimmers short as well. We've just put that little bit of chopped worm in. So I think it just helps. You get that little bit of bait on the bottom, that if there is any better fish in the area, they'll come in and home straight over the top of that chopped worm. Now, starting on a deck rig, it's a 4x12s, but it's got strung shot top to bottom. You get a nice slow fall with the caster on the hook. May take a little bit of time for the fish to come into the peg to start with. It's just a case of letting the rig fall through the peg. If you don't get a bite, leave it to sit stationary on the deck for 20 seconds or so, then lift the rig out and turn it over again. You want to constantly loose feed casters out of your hand on this short line. It's the best way really of getting these roach to come in and feed constantly on the bait that's falling through the water. It's very important when you turn the rig over that the line between the float and the hook is straight. When you're fishing with a strung bulk like we are today, the shots are pretty much equally shotted between the top and bottom of the rig. It's a 6-inch hook length, and they're number 10 shot, so you can read them nicely on the float as they go down. And it's so important to make sure that the line is tight between the float and the hook. If it's not, you won't see any of the indications from fish touching the bait as it's falling through the peg. If you just drop it in a clump, what you'll find is, although the bait will get to the bottom and you may get a bite when the rig's stationary, you won't see any of the indications of fish that are actually intercepting the bait on the way down. There's no need to hold the float tight. It's just important to make sure that the line between the float and the hook is tight. You can then let the float cock naturally and follow the hook to the bottom. There's a little indication then as the bait's falling. It shows there's some fish coming into the swim now. Quite often with these short caster lines, it can take a while to build the peg. It's just a case of keeping the bait going in and waiting for the fish to turn up. The rig's actually set about 1 inch over depth, so when the bait gets to the bottom, you can hold it nice and stationary in the peg, which, if there is some better fish around, perhaps a skimmer or a good roach that's feeding on the deck, you want the bait to be stationary. The last thing you want is for it to be moving around looking unnatural. And that's why once the rig's actually cocked and got to the bottom, I'll leave it for 20 seconds or so, because you've just got that chance of that slightly better fish that may be down there feeding on the deck, that's not taking casters as they're falling through the water. I often find with silverfish that the harder you work, the more you catch. And it's just so important to keep feeding. The more you feed, the more chance you have of drawing fresh fish into your peg. It's another little indication. It's only a matter of time before we start catching some fish. In a match scenario, when everybody around you is feeding, if you feed less regularly than anybody else and you're trying to catch fish, perhaps through the water or shallow, you're going to end up with less fish in your peg. That's why it's important to make sure that you're constantly feeding and working the rig, because it will just mean that you should hopefully catch more than the anglers around you. It doesn't reward lazy fishing. Nice bite there. It was in the last third of the peg. think probably a fish that's just been intercepting those casters as they're falling through. It was like a skimmer. Yeah, a nice fish. It's a good start. 10 or 12 ounces. The roach actually, when we turned up today, looked as though they were spawning. I think there's a good chance that we may struggle to catch any real number of roach, but hopefully we'll catch some skimmers as the day goes on, particularly on the long pole. So it's a case of just shipping out, turning the rig over again and feeding. Try to feed as tight onto your swim as you can, onto the float. The tighter you feed, the more compact the fish will be in the swim. Particularly when you're fishing through the water, you want to know that your bait is actually falling in the same column as the loose feed that you're feeding into the swim. That rig's just got to the bottom now, so we'll leave it 15 or 20 seconds, see if there's any more skimmers. That last fish took the bait, I would say, in the last third of the peg. I'll just lift the rig out and turn it over again. Nice thing with number 10 shot on a rig like this, although it's only a 4x12 float and you may think that a number 10 is quite a big shot when you're fishing through the water, is that you can actually watch each individual shot cock on the float. The problem with a smaller shot is, although you may get a slower fall through the water, you can't actually tell exactly where the rig is in the peg. And that's the beauty of a number 10, is that you can tell almost exactly where the float is at any given time. It's another good skimmer. Ten or 12 ounces again. Now, just caught that fish, so we'll just loose feed again. Keep the fish there and interested. One thing that I think is quite important when you're fishing for these commercial silverfish is to fish with decent hooks and line. Now, I've got an 011 main line on there down to an 010 hook length and quite a big hook. It's a size 16, which for a single caster there's quite a lot of hook showing. I'm only just nicking the bait, but you're looking to catch quite big weights. You'd look at catching 30 pound as a minimum, and weights 50 or 60 pound are quite often fairly easy to come by on these short caster lines. And that's why you want to make sure that you've got a decent hook on. If you're going to be swinging these fish to hand and catching big weights quickly, there's no need to have a small hook on. They're not going to be line shy. They're coming into the swim, they're intercepting the bait as it falls to the deck. And it's important to make sure that you've got a decent bit of steel in their mouths when the float goes under. Again, just make sure that there's some bait going into the peg. There's more and more fish turning up now. Just started to get an odd missed bite, which is suggesting to me that the fish may be starting to come off the bottom, which will see me reach for my lighter rig, which is 4x10s, same line and hook, but it's set at half depth. Well, some days you'll find that fishing shallow is best, and you can put a big weight together quickly fishing shallow, and other days you'll find that actually the fish can be smaller when you're fishing shallow, and then you'll find that it's actually best to feed larger quantities of bait out of your hand, decent handfuls of casters, and fish through the water but on the deck, because you may catch better stamped fish. We've already caught a couple of skimmers and we've not yet caught a roach, which is suggesting to me that the roach perhaps are spawning and they're not that interested in feeding, so we may have to adjust the way that we're fishing the peg. It may be that feeding larger quantities of bait less often and leaving the rig a little bit more stationary on the deck results in better quality fish. The two matches I've fished here have caught very well on this short caster line. Never caught a great volume of skimmers on it, but the roach have been a really nice stamp. One day I actually caught 32 pounds of roach, short on casters, and then I caught a few skimmers long later in the match. The roach are a good stamp, and this short caster line really is the best way of piecing a net of roach together. Commercial silverfish fishing is not necessarily about speed, as the fish are often a good stamp, just more about being efficient and making sure that you come back with a fish every cast, as opposed to shipping in and out as quickly as you can and getting yourself worked up about trying to catch too quickly. It's more about just making sure that what you do is right, and when you get a bite and you catch the fish, they're the right size and the right species of fish that you need to target on the day. Feel more and more that we may be fishing for skimmers today as opposed to roach. And that long skimmer line that I'm just keeping my eye on now, there's no fizzing yet, but I don't think it'll be long until I start to see that swim fizz. Maybe the best solution today to putting a net of fish together. Just started to sort of settle down. It's not been typical of the fishing here at Lavender. We've not caught many roach at all. I think they're more interested in spawning at the moment. And what we found best is actually to feed a larger quantity of bait less regularly. When you're fishing for roach, little and often through the water tends to be best. You start to catch the roach as the rig's falling, and you can amass a big weight quite quickly. But today it just seems to be that there's a few more skimmers around and less roach, and that you're better off feeding a bigger quantity of bait, maybe 30 or 40 casters at a time, letting the rig settle, giving it 20 seconds or so. If you don't get a bite, turn it over, not necessarily when there's feed going through the water, but because you're fishing for these better stamped fish, if you're feeding all the time, they seem to want to be at all depths, and you're not getting proper bites. Whereas if you just feed a good quantity of bait, the bait gets to the bottom, it's still drawing fish in, the noise is still drawing fish in, but it's concentrating them on the bottom, and you tend to get a better bite. And we've caught some nice fish so far. Some big skimmers, a few nice roach, not many, but every fish we've caught has generally been a good stamp. If you don't get a bite within a minute or so, it's just a case of feeding a few more casters again, keeping them going in, turning the rig over. As I say, important again to keep that line tight between the float and the hook. There's a bite there. Feels like it might be a roach. There it is. Lovely stamp. Nice roach there, 6 or 8 ounces. You haven't got to catch that quickly to put a really big weight of fish of that size together. 150 or so fish. So you have a really nice weight. And on matches where you perhaps fishing for carp, but you don't draw the best peg on the lake, but you still want a chance of winning a few quid, then fishing for these silverfish in this way is a great way of actually having a day's sport as well if you don't draw the best peg. A hybrid, taking the bait on the drop. And at the end of the day, it's more important to have a good day and a few bites than it is to sit and moan about a bad peg. And this method just makes sure that you get a few bites really. The 30 or 40 casters gone in then. The rig's just got to the bottom there. Little indication. Just started to see a little bit of fizzing out on the long pole line. I don't think it'll be long until we have a look for some skimmers out there. Lift the rig and turn it over again. Don't need to feed every chuck. A little fish there, taking it on the drop. fish like that really, when you're trying to put a big weight together, that you want to avoid. And that's partly why feeding the larger quantities of bait less regularly will see you catch better stamped fish. If you feed small quantities all the time, I think you quite often attract fish like that into the peg. And whilst it's good because it's active, it's not always the best way of putting a decent weight of fish together. Commercial fisheries now are stuffed full of big silvers. Best way so far today, when that rig settles, is it tends to be the last sort of third of the peg that these better stamped fish are sat in. Another hybrid there. If there's one fish that likes a loose fed caster, it's a hybrid. I can't get enough of them. Pick out a nice dark shell. It's just a case of repeating the process, shipping out, turning the rig over, decent quantity of bait in again, and let the rig settle. Because there was a lot of skimmers in the peg, I've started to feed over a slightly larger area. I was grouping the bait very tightly at the start. And because the skimmers are big high-sided fish, we're getting a lot of false indications, but by just putting the bait over a slightly wider area, when you do get a bite, you tend to get the fish in the mouth. Another little roach. Important as well to keep your elastic wet and working well in the pole. You'll see that when I unhook a fish and slip it in the net, put a bait on the hook and then just draw the elastic through the water by your feet and just make sure that it's got plenty of water on it so that it's flowing nicely in the top kit. You don't want the elastic sticking when you're catching these fish, because you may end up just bumping an odd fish in the peg on the strike, and you don't want that. It'll upset the remaining feeding fish that are in your swim. There's definitely some fizzing out on that long pole. I think we might catch one more and then ship out and see if there's some bream waiting out there. A sharp little indication then on the float. What you're looking for when you're fishing casters, when the rig gets to the bottom, is that the bite should be nice and slow. You don't want these really quick, sharp indications. You just want a nice, slow go under that we've just had there, because that means the fish should, in theory, be hooked nicely in the top lip. So we've caught some roach and skimmers on that short line. And the long line's just started really blowing. So I think the skimmers are turned up out there now. We're fishing sort of about a 2-inch section of worm. We've got a little cad pot on the end of the pole with a little worm and pellet mix in it, with quite a bit of the peat from the worms. So one of the best ways I've found of catching the skimmers on here is to just feed with a toss pot over the top of that initial feed. Just each time you chip out, just a little dollop of bait in the toss pot, a decent size hook bait. Just keeps the skimmers in the peg and interested in the feed. I think it's also important because what you're actually feeding them is product as opposed to just a ground bait. Stops them just sieving the ground bait for particles and actually feeding on proper bait as opposed to the ground bait. That one's just pinched the worm. Just picking out a nice worm, hooking it through the tail and nipping the end off. Probably about a 2-inch section. Nice sized hook bait. Nice dollop of the mix in the pot there. One little tip if you're fishing a shallow lake and you're fishing with a worm, if you can, is to actually ship out with the hook bait in the air. worms are notorious for spinning your line up when you're fishing with them. And the last thing you want is to be constantly changing your hook length because you've got a twizzled line. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind when you're fishing with worms is the diameter of the lines that you use. The line I've got on out there is 0.17 and the hook length's actually 0.15 and the hooks are 14, which may sound ridiculous when you're only fishing for fish up to say 2 or 3 pounds, and as you all know, skimmers don't fight that hard, but the simple reason for that is that you don't want the worm to start twizzling the line up. And the hook makes absolutely no difference when you're fishing with big sections of worms. You can't tell me that the fish that are down there are inspecting the bait. They're eating worms, they're down there, they're picking up quite big sections of bait. A big hook is almost essential really, because it means that you've got a decent hook hold in the fish when you get a bite. Every now and then, if you haven't had a bite, it's worth just lifting the rig, showing any fish that are down there the worm, and lowering it back down over that area that you've just toss-potted in. It's quite a silty bottom here, and as I've said, when the skimmers actually turn up, they give the game away because the peg starts to fizz. Part of the reason when it starts to fizz that I cut the ground bait out is because the more ground bait you feed, the more the peg will fizz, as it starts to send the fish almost into a bit of a craze, and I think they actually stop eating the bait and just home in on the ground bait and start blowing it around the peg and lifting the silt, which causes foul hookers and missed bites and actually makes fishing quite difficult. It's important when you're fishing for skimmers and bream just to be patient. They're big fish, 12 ounces to 2 pounds each. You haven't got to catch that quickly. It's important just to make sure the rig's set nicely in the peg and then just sit and wait. When they're there, you'll get them. It's just a matter of time. It's important as well just to fish a little bit over depth. We're probably 1.5 inches or 2 inches over depth there. Rig's nice and simple. It's just a bulk and a single dropper. So a double bulk essentially, but the peg's not very deep. As I say, it's 3.5 feet deep, and that single dropper will just show any lifts. If the fish comes down, picks the worm up, lifts off the bottom with the hook in its mouth, it'll lift that last dropper and you'll get a nice rise bite. It's important as well when you're fishing shallow lakes like this to make sure you've got a nice soft elastic in. I use a soft hollow, a sort of 6 to 8 hollow. Cushions the strike nicely, and it means that these skimmers don't end up coming straight to the surface in the peg. There's one there. That fish just lifted that bottom shot that we've been talking about and gave that classic sort of bream hold up. It's a good fish. £1.5. Hook nicely in the mouth. Now, I'm not feeding any casters out there at all. The reason for that is that I don't actually want any roach out there. I think if you feed casters, you attract roach, whereas if you don't, you have less chance of actually drawing roach into the peg. It's something that I really believe in on venues like this when you're trying to target skimmers specifically on a line, is that if you can get away with actually cutting casters out, you've got more chance of avoiding the sort of big quantities of roach coming into your swim. You can't cut them out completely. They'll still come in and eat the pellets and dead maggots, but it just reduces the chance of catching big quantities of them. We're feeding casters short, and it's important not to neglect that line because at any point you may have to drop short and catch a few more roach, but it just separates the two types of fish that we're trying to catch. This long line is predominantly skimmers, if we can, or that shorter line is aimed at roach. There's a lot of indications there. I think the fish are starting to come into the peg. Feeding the dead maggots and corn just allows you the chance to try something else on the hook as well. You stop getting bites on worms. 2 dead red maggots is a great hook bait for skimmers, or a small piece of corn. And fished on the same rig, there's no need to alter the rig. You can fish all the baits on the same way. Nice slow bite there. Just lift that rig. There may be a fish there. And reposition it over the bait that we've potted in. Showing the fish the worm, just lowering it slowly in the last part of the peg, is a great way of getting a quick bite. I think because it's quite a big visual bait, when the fish are in the peg they see it, follow it down, and quite often you can get an almost instant response if you lower it down in front of the skimmer. There's another one. That was as a result of just lifting that rig and replacing it. We had an indication. Lifted the rig, lowered it down, and then got a lovely slow bite. There's another good skimmer. We've had another cracking day at Lavender Hall Fishery today, and what we've learned is that today, because the roach have been spawning, it's been more important to target the skimmers. The way we've done that is by feeding larger quantities of bait, less often on the short pole, bigger handfuls of casters, and fishing slightly more positively, a little bit over depth on the bottom on that 5 metre line has caught some better fish. And on the long pole, feeding with a little kinder pot, but potting regularly with minced worms and pellets, and fishing a good sized segment of worm on a hook has seen nearly a skimmer every chuck towards the end of the session. If you're out on a commercial fishery and want to catch some silverfish, the hints and tips in the latest video should stand you in good stead. I hope you enjoy it.